So, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Today is a dark time in America. There's no getting around it. Millions are filing for unemployment. They're facing lost wages, wondering how they might pay their bills, pay their student loans, put food on the table for their kids, so much more. But there's one speck of good news that emerged from this crisis, and that is the final and complete death of libertarianism on the right and on the left. Right now, Republican President Donald Trump is proposing a $1 trillion stimulus package for the American economy, 200 billion more than that was offered by Barack Obama in 2008. He's being pushed by Republican Senator Josh Hawley to increase the payments proposed to working families to thousands of dollars a month provided by the federal government. Others, like Senator Marco Rubio, are proposing that the federal government provide billions to small or medium-sized businesses, and that as long as they use it to keep their workers on payrolls, they don't even have to pay it back to the federal government. Intercept journalist Lee Fang summed it up quite well, saying, quote, Trump suspending mortgage foreclosures, demanding cash payments to Americans, now invoking the Defense Production Act to force private firms to produce needed supplies is incredible. It's kind of a shell shock for anybody who reported on any economic policies in the Obama years. Long gone are the days of people holding up pocketbook constitutions and keyboard warriors on Twitter railing against taxpayer bailouts for anyone because they should have had the good sense and personal responsibility to anticipate a global pandemic in which we were all literally forced to stay inside and not spend money. The debate on Capitol Hill today is not whether we should bail people and affected industries out, but what strings may I want to attach to that money for businesses, or exactly how many billions they want to get. The corporate Democrats were not ready for this, as I covered in my radar yesterday. They are completing the Hillary maneuver by working for shedding average Americans from their political coalition and relying on the votes of rich people in the suburbs, Wall Street, and their African American voting base. They've left workers out in the cold in their worst time of need with the fake paid sick leave bill and Chuck Schumer galvanizing Democratic support for less relief of American families than the GOP. It's a welcome development. When the right was faced with crisis, they made the final break away from the libertarian deadweights that have weighed them down politically for so long. And as Crystal covered in her radar yesterday, we don't ask questions about how we're going to pay for each individual line item of this bailout crisis because we understand that a pandemic is the definition of a problem that affects all of us, and there is no way to personal responsibility or individualism your way out of this one. The way that political change happens in this country is maddening. You slog away, you can talk into the ether, you shout and you yell and more for years and years and years and years, and nothing ever happens. But then, in a span of just a few months, literally, the entire world can change. That's where we are today. The right is ditching libertarianism in a flash in the pan. They're accepting the idea that when the public good is threatened, it is okay to act in the public interests economically. The corporate wing of the Democratic Party is learning that their lip service to working people while selling them out for nearly a generation isn't going to be enough anymore. Sure, they looked fine when they were posed up against people who literally didn't believe in public policy, but now they're actually going to have to fight on the merits. And it appears that they've made their choice. They want to be the party of suburban preferred incremental change and of nothing will fundamentally change loving Wall Street. Sound familiar? The future of American politics is now one that we advocate for on this show, hating the elites of the country with everything that we've got and having both sides fight for the interests of working Americans. Banished forever are those who bemoan taxpayer-funded bailouts to people who are standing on the edge of a cliff at no fault of their own. Their ideology is finally revealed as ridiculous to the very people who it matters most to, the voters. And at least that's the silver lining that I can find for today.
Saagar, I'm old enough to remember. In fact, I was running for Congress in 2010 in the Tea Party wave, which was in part like a backlash. It was part of this whole like, oh, Obama's a socialist and how dare you have an economic stimulus, which, by the way, was like a third tax cuts was the stimulus. It was the most like neoliberal, centrist, corporatist, moderate thing you could possibly imagine. Obviously insufficient to the task since unemployment went up to 10%. And so to watch the evolution between that moment and now, when you have any Republicans saying, yes, let's go forward with cash payments, no, even that is insufficient, is kind of mind blowing. I mean, of course, there's like an obvious level of hypocrisy here. Now that it's their guy in the White House, they feel differently about it. But there has also been a genuine sort of changing of the guard and change of heart in terms of the underlying view of government and government's ability to set policy and agenda that could actually help working people. The thing that I wonder about from you is like, you still have a lot of, and we've seen in the Trump administration, even though he ran on this more populist agenda, he and his administration have very much been influenced by that Chamber of Commerce wing of the party. The corporate tax cut obviously is the most, clear-cut example of that. So do you think after the crisis that the party continues in the Chamber of Commerce libertarian direction, or do you think that they hold on to some of this populism that they've turned to in this crisis?
I think the populism will hold on for this reason, which is that Trump made the kind of a Faustian bargain in the beginning with Gary Cohn and many of these other people who convinced him that his political popularity would be tied to the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And so he and all of his administration, from an economic policy perspective, were obsessed with increasing GDP numbers and keeping the stock market blowing out, despite the fact that it's basically against what he ran on in the first place. But what I think happened is that whenever he realized that we were in the midst of this complete crisis, whenever we had people like Larry Kudlow going on trying to, boost markets and ended up dropping them by 2,000 points. I mean, look, the Dow Jones is actually now at a lower point than when Trump took office. And that's why I think that his positioning has changed so much. He's now talking about how he's a wartime president, and that's invoking the Defense Production Act in order to spin up masks from private companies. I mean, these are good. And I mean, from my view, these are things I've been trying to advocate for on the right now for a couple of years now. And I think what ended up happening is he realized that, look, in terms of the stock market, that's gone. They tried everything they possibly could in order to try and juice the markets up. But as we said here from the very beginning, you can't juice a market when there's no money. There's no market. Like, market's in an exchange of goods and services. There are no exchanges of goods and services happening in our economy right now. The only way to get the economy working back again is to defeat the virus. It's like the center of gravity for everything. We have to kill the virus and we have to float the economy in the meantime. There's only one way to do that, and that is the government. If the government did not do this, people would plunge into poverty because people would literally plunge into poverty. They would lose everything that they've amassed, some of the meager savings that they've been able to get since the 2008 financial crisis. And it would be, if the financial crisis would look tame to the amount of wealth that this would wipe out from the American economy, and especially working and middle class Americans. So I actually do think the populism is here to stay at the very end. Now, look, I mean, I don't know why it took 3.5 years for somebody who ran on something in order to embrace it, but I'm not going to hit the guy whenever he's up. And I think that from the congressional perspective, what is most interesting to me is it seems, and you said this yesterday, I think the audience loved it, is when you were like, the truth is they haven't thought about it. A lot of these established Democrats, they just haven't thought about what's going on. And what's shocking me is, look, the congressional opening that you see in the GOP from Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley and so many others, that is a result of Donald Trump becoming president and people sitting around being like, hey, what happened here? What's going on? And yet in the Democratic Party, you have Bernie Sanders, who almost won the Democratic nomination for president and would have if they hadn't stepped up in order to kill him at the very last second. And yet they have not learned a single thing. No. And because of that, that's what actually shocks me more than anything, is that you don't see even some sort of realignment on the left.
No, you see a realignment. It's a realignment around affluent suburbanites,
right,
plus, Black and brown working class who they won't do anything for their economic interests. They'll just basically be like, we're not racist, so you have to stick with us. But I don't want to forget that it took Trump a while before he remotely grasped the scope of this crisis.
Oh, yeah.
He was
terrible.
Downplaying it.
Right.
And the time that we lost in the beginning is in itself, a disaster. You compare to South Korea and the U.S. had our first cases arrive and test positive on the same day. South Korea, of course, has flooded the zone with tests and seem to have done a much better job of getting this thing under control quickly, which means that their economy will be able to get back to normal much more quickly. Trump dithered. There were no tests. There's still not nearly sufficient tests. So we still have no idea how widespread the virus even is. That failure to act in the beginning is going to have massive, massive consequences. And I don't want to overlook that. I also don't want to overlook the fact that if it wasn't for Tucker Carlson flying to Mar-a-Lago, risking, now we know, coronavirus, by the way, to tell Trump, you have to take this seriously. This is a war. This is your enemy. You have to wrap your head around this. I don't know that they would have ever gotten on board with it. So it's incredible how, just one act, one event, one person who has some influence with him coming to him and making the case over what reportedly was ours, how that turned the direction. But that makes me skeptical, more skeptical than you, that this is a lasting position for the GOP. And why? Because we know how influential those corporate powers and that money and that coziness and the jobs they all want to get when they leave Congress. We know how much that has corrupted our entire system on the left and the right. So you have to not just fall into it in a moment of crisis. You have to be committed to it and fight for it every single day.
Yeah, we're gonna see whether this stays. And look, if they stray, I'll be the first here calling it out. I was calling them out in the beginning about how much of a disaster the initial response was and how they need to act like a wartime president. And yeah, he owns it. And whatever the consequences come from that. But and I think I'm trying to separate here, which is, look, I don't really care how it got done. It did get done. There was the turn. There was a change in posture. And that is something that I think is a good thing, both for the country and I think for the long-term movement. I think what we have to do is what we talked about here. You have to show people that it's the craven choice in order to be populist. So what you're going to see, because frankly, we're the only ones who actually have actual political support and understanding of the political and economic undercurrents of the country writ large. So this is a way in order to do that. Look, maybe I look like an idiot in a month and they'll pass a bailout for Boeing, and then Boeing will buy back all of its stock and continue building planes that don't work. And you know what? I'll say it. I'll eat it right here on this show. But I am hopeful, at least for the moment, based on some of the discussions I've had. And I've just never seen a moment like this where there was at least the opportunity. And it would be foolish not to be at least hopeful in the short run. Yeah.
And that your point about it being the craven choice, I think that's that's when you've reached a tipping point, is when at least, posturing as a populist, fine, posture, be a real populist, whatever. It's the craven choice. That's when you see the real tipping point here. All right, we have more rising for you just after this.